The rain had painted Chicago in shades of silver and shadow, the city's pulse thrumming beneath a sky that refused to relent. In the penthouse suite of the Four Seasons, high above the glittering sprawl of Michigan Avenue, Liam Smith stirred from a sleep he hadn't meant to take. His eyes, sharp as cut glass, opened to a world that felt askew like a painting hung just off-center. The air was heavy with the scent of rain-soaked leather, and something softer, unfamiliar, a trace of lavender, faint but persistent, clinging to the edges of his consciousness. He lay still for a moment, his mind recalibrating, piecing together the fragments of a night that shouldn't have existed. Liam Smith was not a man who made mistakes. As the billionaire CEO of Smith Enterprises, his life was a symphony of precision, each note played with the certainty of a man who owned the world, or at least the parts of it that mattered. From the tech patents he secured to the curated circle of confidants he allowed past his walls, every choice was deliberate, every outcome calculated. Emotion was a variable he had long since eliminated from the equation. Yet here he was, in a bed that wasn't his, the silk sheets cool against his skin, and beside him, a stranger. His gaze fell on her first, a woman curled tightly on her side, her back to him, her breathing so shallow it barely disturbed the air. She was not the kind of woman who belonged in his orbit. No trace of designer perfume lingered, no glint of diamond earrings caught the morning light. Her presence was quiet, almost spectral, as if she were trying to vanish into the folds of the sheets. Her hair, a cascade of dark curls, spilled across the pillow, catching the faint glow of dawn that slipped through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Liam's eyes narrowed, his mind racing to reconstruct the night, but the details were maddeningly elusive. A gala at the Art Institute, a blur of champagne flutes, a late-night conversation with a board member about a merger, then nothing. A blank space where memory should have been. He shifted the movement, drawing his attention to the sheets beneath him. A faint smear of crimson stained the pristine white stark, and undeniable, like a confession written in blood. His breath caught not out of fear or guilt, but from the cold, sharp realization that something had shattered his carefully constructed world. Protocol had been broken, and he didn't know how or why. The blood was real, its implications heavier than the rain outside. She was a virgin, or had been until last night. The thought landed like a stone in his chest, stirring something he couldn't name. Not regret, not desire, but a quiet disquiet, a crack in the armor of his control. He studied her again more closely now. Her frame was slight, her shoulders hunched, as if shielding herself from the world, even in sleep. A crumpled dress, simple and navy, lay discarded on the marble floor beside his tailored jacket, the contrast as jarring as the blood on the sheets. A silver tray sat on the nightstand, its contents untouched. A bottle of Dom Perignon, 2 flutes, a small bowl of strawberries glistening with condensation. The scene felt like it belonged in a fever dream, not his reality. Yet here it was, raw and unscripted, demanding answers he didn't have. She stirred a soft wince escaping her lips as she shifted her fingers, clutching the edge of the blanket like a lifeline. Her movement was cautious, as if every motion cost her something. When she turned to face him, her eyes were wide, dark pools of something between fear and shame, her lashes damp from tears that had long since dried. Her skin, a rich ebony, glowed faintly in the morning light, but her expression was guarded. Her lips parted, as if words were too heavy to form. Liam's voice, when it came, was low and steady, cutting through the silence like a blade. "What's your name?" She hesitated, her gaze flickering to the floor before returning to him. "Natalia." She whispered, her voice fragile, as if saying her name was an act of surrender. Natalia White. The words trembled, barely audible, yet they carried a weight that pressed against the room's stillness. Liam leaned forward slightly, his eyes searching her face for deception, but found none. Only vulnerability, raw and unpolished, staring back at him. "How did you end up in my room?" His tone was calm, but there was an edge to it, a demand for clarity in a situation that defied logic. She swallowed her hands, twisting the blanket tighter. "I work here," she said, her voice steadier now, though still soft. "Room service." "I was told to bring a tray to room 2701, but the numbers on the doors were wrong. Swapped. I didn't know this was your suite. I didn't know." Her words trailed off, her eyes dropping again, as if the weight of his gaze was too much to bear. Liam's mind churned, piecing together her story. A mix-up, a clerical error, a moment of chaos, in a system he assumed was flawless. He studied her, the way her hands trembled, the way her eyes refused to meet his for more than a moment. She wasn't lying. No one could fake the kind of shame that clung to her like a second skin, or the quiet terror in her posture, as if she expected him to destroy what little she had left. And then there was the blood, a silent witness to a truth neither of them had anticipated. She hadn't planned this. She wasn't a schemer, not a gold digger playing a long game. She was an accident, a variable he hadn't accounted for. She moved then, gathering her dress with shaking hands, avoiding his gaze as she stumbled toward the door. "I'll go," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please, don't report me. I can't lose this job. It's all I have." Each word was a plea not for mercy, but for invisibility, as if she could erase herself from his world and pretend this night had never happened. Her fingers brushed the doorknob, her steps unsteady, and Liam felt something shift inside him. Not pity, not desire, but something deeper, something that defied the cold logic he lived by. "Wait," he said, the word slipping out before he could stop it. She froze her hand, hovering in midair, her back still to him. The room seemed to hold its breath. The rain outside a soft murmur against the windows. When she turned, her expression was unreadable, a mask of caution and curiosity. Liam stood, his bare feet silent against the marble floor, and for the first time in years, he felt the ground beneath him waver. He was about to say something. No version of himself had ever rehearsed something that broke every rule he'd ever made. "You're not going anywhere," he said, his voice quiet but firm. Not a threat, not a command, but a decision carved from a place he hadn't known existed until this moment. Natalia's eyes widened, a flicker of fear, giving way to something else, confusion perhaps, or the faintest spark of hope. She didn't speak, didn't move, but the air between them crackled with possibility, a thread stretched taut between two strangers who had stumbled into each other's lives by mistake. Liam's gaze fell to the floor, where a small silver bracelet lay, forgotten its delicate chain, glinting in the dawn. Engraved on its surface were the words, "For Nia, from Mom." He bent to pick it up, the metal cool against his fingers, and when he looked at her again, he saw not just a stranger, but a story, one he wasn't sure he was ready to hear, but couldn't bring himself to walk away from. The rain continued to fall, a relentless curtain beyond the glass. But inside the penthouse, something new was taking shape. Natalia stood frozen, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure he could hear it. She didn't know why he'd stopped her, why a man like Liam Smith, tall, broad-shouldered, with eyes like a winter storm, and a presence that filled the room, would care about a woman like her. She was nobody, a shadow. In a city that didn't see her, a girl who'd learned to survive by staying small, staying silent. Yet here he was, holding her bracelet like it was a relic, his gaze piercing through the walls she'd spent years building. "I don't understand," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why do you care?" The question hung between them, raw and unadorned, and for a moment, Liam didn't have an answer. He wasn't a man who acted on impulse, who let instinct override reason. But there was something about her, the way her hands trembled, the way her eyes held a quiet defiance, beneath the fear that made him want to unravel her, to understand what had brought her here, to his room, to this moment. "I don't know." He admitted, his voice softer now, almost vulnerable. "But I'm not letting you walk out that door until I do." It wasn't a promise, not yet, but it was the beginning of something neither of them could name, a collision of worlds, a spark in the dark, a story that was only just beginning to unfold. And as the rain beat against the windows, washing the city clean, Liam and Natalia stood on the edge of something vast and uncharted, their futures entwined by a single night that neither had meant to happen. The Chicago wind howled through the south side, carrying the bite of autumn and the faint tang of asphalt and rust. Natalia White moved through her world like a ghost, her steps quick and silent as she navigated the cracked sidewalks of Englewood, her breath visible in the early morning chill. At 24, she had learned to wear her life like a second skin, tough, unyielding, but invisible to those who didn't care to look. Her days were a relentless rhythm of survival. Mornings cleaning rooms at the Four Seasons, afternoons serving drinks at a dimly lit bar in Pilsen, evenings delivering takeout orders on a bicycle that creaked with every turn. Each job was a thread in the fragile tapestry that kept her and her younger brother Jacob afloat. Jacob, with his lopsided grin and insulin pump, was the only light in a world that had taught Natalia to expect darkness. At 16, he still believed in dreams, in the possibility of a future beyond their one-bedroom apartment, with its peeling paint and flickering lights. Natalia clung to that belief, even when her own had worn thin. Her life had been shaped by loss and resilience, each scar a lesson in endurance. She was 10 when her mother, Angela White, died in a car accident, a story the police had told with clipped words and averted eyes, a story Natalia had never fully believed. Angela had been a nurse, her hands gentle, but her spirit fierce, whispering to Natalia in the quiet of their Englewood nights, "Stay quiet, Nia. Stay small. The world doesn't forgive girls like us." Those words had become Natalia's armor, shielding her through foster homes, where kindness was scarce, through courtrooms that saw her skin before her story. At 19, she'd fought back against a man who'd cornered her behind a diner, his breath sour with liquor, his hands too bold. The law hadn't cared that she was defending herself. It saw a black girl with no family, no voice, and branded her with a record that followed her like a shadow. Now she worked under a borrowed name, her real identity buried beneath years of caution, because the world didn't offer second chances to women like her. The night at the Four Seasons had shattered something in her, though she couldn't name it. She saw Liam Smith's face every time she closed her eyes, his sharp jaw, his storm-gray eyes, the way his voice had softened when he said, "You're not going anywhere." It wasn't just the memory of his touch, though her body still hummed with it, a quiet ache she didn't dare acknowledge. It was the way he'd looked at her, not with pity or judgment, but with a curiosity that felt dangerous, like he saw the parts of her she'd spent years hiding. She'd spent days avoiding the hotel's upper floors, trading shifts to stay in housekeeping, where the work was grueling but safe. Yet the bracelet he'd picked up, the one her mother had given her, burned in her pocket, like a secret she wasn't ready to share. For Nia, from Mom. It was the last piece of Angela she had, and Liam's fingers on it had felt like a violation, a bridge between her past and a present she couldn't trust. Across the city, in a glass-walled penthouse overlooking Puget Sound in Seattle, Liam Smith sat alone the skyline, a constellation of lights that failed to warm the hollow in his chest. At 32, he was a man who had conquered everything MIT. At 20, a startup sold for billions. At 23, the CEO of Smith Enterprises. By 28, after his father's stroke left the family empire in his hands. Born in Bellevue, Washington, behind gates that kept the world at bay, Liam had been raised to see life as a chessboard, every move calculated, every piece expendable. His father, Edward Smith, had taught him that power was a currency and trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. Women came and went, drawn to his wealth or his intensity, but none stayed long enough to breach the walls he'd built. Feelings were unpredictable, and unpredictability was a risk he refused to take. Yet Natalia White had slipped past his defenses, a variable he hadn't anticipated. He couldn't shake the image of her, those dark, guarded eyes, the way her hands trembled as she reached for her dress, the quiet strength in her voice when she begged him not to report her. He'd run her name through every database he could access. But Natalia White yielded nothing. No employee records, no social media, no trace of a life. It unsettled him, not because he thought she was lying, but because it meant she was hiding, and Liam didn't like what he couldn't define. He found himself distracted, his thoughts drifting during board meetings, his fingers tracing the edge of his desk, as if it could anchor him to the order he craved. He'd grown up watching his father dismantle lives, with a single signature employees, let go without a second thought, their faces blurred into a montage of resignation. That memory haunted him now, a reminder of the man he didn't want to become. Natalia, too, was haunted, though her ghosts were different. She saw them in the cracked mirror of her apartment, in the insulin vials she counted like precious gems, in the dreams where her mother's voice still whispered, "Stay small, Nia." The night with Liam had been a mistake, a collision of worlds that should never have met. She'd felt his hands on her gentle, in a way that didn't match the man he seemed to be, and it terrified her. Not because of what had happened, but because of what it stirred, a longing she'd buried long ago, a hope that felt like a betrayal of everything she'd learned. She didn't belong in his world, a place of glass towers and gala invitations, where her skin and her past would always mark her as an outsider. She needed to stay invisible, to save enough to move Jacob to a place where the air was clean and the schools didn't smell of despair. Oregon, maybe, with its endless forests and quiet skies. It was a dream she didn't dare speak aloud, but it kept her moving, kept her fighting. Liam, meanwhile, found himself drawn back to Chicago, a city he'd once dismissed as a hub of chaos. He told himself it was business, a potential merger with a Midwest tech firm, but the truth was simpler and more unsettling. He wanted to see her again, to understand why a single night had left such a mark. He lingered in the Four Seasons service corridors, his presence absurd in a gray hoodie and jeans, a billionaire, out of place, among mops and laundry carts. The staff stared, their whispers trailing him like smoke, but he didn't care. He waited until he saw her pushing a cleaning cart, her head down, her curls tucked under a scarf. When she noticed him, her eyes widened and she dropped a bottle of cleaner, the plastic clattering against the tile. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice sharp with fear and something softer, something she couldn't hide. "I needed to see you." He said the words raw, unpolished, as if they'd slipped past his usual restraint. Her lips parted, but no sound came. She crossed her arms, her posture a shield, but her eyes betrayed her curious, wary, alive. "You shouldn't be here," she said, glancing down the corridor. "Someone will see. I can't." She stopped her breath, hitching. "I can't do this." Do what he asked, stepping closer, his voice low, almost tender. "Talk to me. Tell me why you're hiding under a name that isn't yours." Her head snapped up, her eyes blazing with defiance, but she didn't deny it. That silence was answer enough, and it intrigued him more than any lie could have. He didn't know her story, but he wanted to, needed to, in a way that defied his logic. Natalia felt the walls closing in her heart, a wild thing caged in her chest. He was too close, his presence too large, his questions too sharp. She wanted to run, to disappear back into the shadows where she belonged, but something in his gaze held her still, a flicker of vulnerability, a crack in the armor of a man who seemed untouchable. "You don't know me," she said, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. "And you don't want to. People like you don't belong in places like this." Maybe he said, his eyes never leaving hers. "But I'm here anyway." And in that moment, something shifted. A thread stretched between them, fragile but unbreakable, pulling them toward a future neither could yet see. The corridor was silent, the world outside forgotten, and for the first time, Natalia wondered if invisibility was a choice she could unmake. The Chicago skyline glittered like a fractured promise, its light slicing through the dusk, as Natalia White stood in the service corridor of the Four Seasons, her heart a tangled knot of defiance and longing. Days had passed since Liam Smith's unexpected appearance. His words, "I'm here anyway," echoing in her mind like a melody she couldn't shake. She told herself to forget him, to bury the memory of his storm-gray eyes and the way his voice softened when he spoke her name. But the truth was stubborn, clinging to her, like the damp chill of autumn. Every creak of the hotel's service elevator, every shadow in the hallway, made her pulse quicken, half expecting to see him again. She hated how much she wanted it, how much she feared it. Natalia had spent her life building walls, each brick forged from betrayal and loss. Yet Liam had slipped through them with a single glance, a single question. It wasn't just his wealth or his presence that unsettled her. It was the way he saw her, not as a maid, not as a shadow, but as a woman with a story he wanted to understand. In Seattle, Liam sat in his penthouse, the Puget Sound, stretching dark and endless beyond his windows. The city's quiet beauty felt hollow tonight, its serenity a stark contrast to the restlessness that had taken root in him. He was a man who thrived on order, his days mapped out in spreadsheets and boardroom strategies. Yet, Natalia White had become a variable he couldn't solve. He'd returned to Chicago twice in the past week, each trip cloaked in the pretense of business, a site visit, a client dinner. But the truth was simpler, rawer. He needed to see her, to unravel the mystery of a woman who hid her name and her past, but couldn't hide the fire in her eyes. He'd watched her in that corridor, her posture rigid, her voice sharp, yet there was a softness beneath it, a vulnerability that made him want to protect her, even if he didn't understand why. Liam wasn't a man who chased feelings. They were too unpredictable, too dangerous. But Natalia was a puzzle, and he'd never been able to resist a challenge. Their encounters had become a quiet ritual, stolen moments in the hotel's back hallways, where the world couldn't intrude. They spoke in whispers, their words weaving a fragile bridge between their worlds. Natalia told him about Jacob, her brother, whose laughter could still light up her darkest days, and about the Englewood streets that had taught her to survive. Liam shared fragments of his own life, nights spent staring at the sound, wondering if his success was his own or just an inheritance he'd polished to a shine. Each conversation was a step closer, a risk neither could fully name. Natalia felt the weight of her secrets pressing against her chest, the borrowed name she used the past she'd buried. Liam sensed her hesitation, the way she held herself like a bird ready to flee, and it made him want to stay, to prove he was different from the men who'd hurt her. One evening, as the city hummed below, Liam found her on the hotel's rooftop terrace, a hidden corner, where staff sometimes stole a moment to breathe. She stood against the railing, her silhouette framed by the skyline, her curls catching the glow of distant lights. "You keep showing up," she said, not turning her voice a mix of exasperation and warmth. "Don't you have an empire to run?" "I do," he said, stepping closer, his hands in his pockets to keep from reaching for her. "But empires can wait. You can't." The words slipped out unguarded, and he saw her shoulders tense, then soften. She turned her eyes, searching his, and for a moment the world was just the two of them, the wind carrying their secrets away. "Why me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You could have anyone. Women who belong in your world. Why a maid from Southside?" There was no self-pity in her tone, only a raw honesty that cut through him. He didn't have an answer, not one that made sense. Instead, he reached out his fingers, brushing the silver bracelet on her wrist, the one that read, "For Nia from Mom." "Because you're real," he said, "and I'm tired of everything else." The moment hung between them, fragile as glass, until Natalia stepped back, her gaze dropping to the city below. "You don't know what real means," she said, but there was no venom in her words, only a quiet ache. She wanted to believe him, to let herself fall into the possibility of him, but trust was a luxury she'd never afforded. Yet when he asked her to join him at a gala in Napa Valley, a charity event hosted by his family, she didn't say no. Not because of the money he offered, though she needed it for Jacob's insulin, but because of the way he looked at her, like she was more than her scars, more than her secrets. The drive to Napa was a blur of vineyards and golden hills, the sleek black SUV, a stark contrast to the CTA buses Natalia knew by heart. She wore a borrowed dress, emerald green, and flowing its fabric foreign against her skin. Liam sat beside her, his silence a steady presence, his hand resting close enough to hers that she could feel its warmth. The Smith estate loomed like a dream, its white stone walls and endless windows glowing under the California sun. Inside, chandeliers cast prisms across the ballroom, and guests in tailored suits and glittering gowns moved like actors in a play Natalia didn't know the lines to. She felt their eyes on her, the weight of their curiosity, their judgment. Margaret, Liam's grandmother, greeted her with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, her voice cool as she said, "You must be Liam's friend." The word was a blade, sharp and deliberate, and Natalia felt it slice through her. She held her ground, her chin high, her smile polite, but unyielding. She'd faced worse than Margaret's disapproval foster parents, who saw her as a burden, judges who saw her as trouble. This was just another battlefield, and she knew how to survive. Liam stayed close, his hand brushing hers, in quiet reassurance. But she felt the tension in him, the way his jaw tightened when his cousin, a wiry man, with a smirk, whispered something to a guest and glanced her way. During dinner, Natalia overheard a woman at the next table murmur, "She's not one of us." And the words stung more than she expected, not because they were true, but because they reminded her of every door that had closed in her face. Later in the garden away from the crowd, Liam found her standing by a fountain, the water catching the moonlight, like scattered stars. "You're doing better than I expected," he said, his voice low, a smile tugging at his lips. She laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. "I'm surviving," she said. "It's what I do." But when he stepped closer, his hand finding hers, she didn't pull away. The night air was cool, fragrant with jasmine, and for a moment, she let herself imagine a world where she belonged beside him, where her past didn't cast a shadow over every step. Their conversations grew deeper in the weeks that followed, stolen moments in Chicago's hidden corners, a diner in Wicker Park, a bench by Lake Michigan, the rooftop where the city felt far away. Natalia told him about her mother Angela, whose laughter could fill a room, and about the night she learned of her death, the police officer's voice cold and final. Liam spoke of his father Edward, whose expectations were a weight he'd carried since childhood, and of the nights he sat alone wondering if his life was his own. Each story was a confession, a crack in their armor, and Natalia felt herself falling not just for him, but for the possibility of a life where she didn't have to hide. One night under a sky heavy with stars, they sat on the hotel rooftop, a blanket draped over their shoulders, 2 cups of coffee cooling between them. Natalia looked out at the skyline, its towers like sentinels, and said, "This city makes me feel small." Liam's gaze softened, his fingers brushing hers. "It makes me feel alone," he admitted. And then, without thinking, he leaned in his lips, finding hers in a kiss that was hesitant, careful, as if afraid to break something fragile. She kissed him back, her heart racing, her fears and hopes colliding in a single breath. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was the beginning of something neither could deny, a spark in the dark, a promise neither was ready to keep, but neither could let go. The Chicago night pressed against the windows of Natalia White's cramped South Side apartment, its darkness a mirror to the unease that had settled in her chest. She sat at the kitchen table, a single bulb flickering above, casting shadows across the papers strewn before her old letters, faded photographs, a newspaper clipping, yellowed with age. Her mother Angela smiled, in one, her eyes bright with a warmth Natalia could still feel even 14 years after her death. The clipping from a Chicago Tribune article dated 1998 mentioned a car accident on Lakeshore Drive, a tragedy dismissed as a random loss. But Natalia had never believed it was random. The police report had been too vague, the officer's eyes too quick to slide away from hers when she asked questions as a child. Now, at 24, with Liam Smith's presence stirring memories she'd buried, she found herself digging again, chasing ghosts she wasn't sure she wanted to find. Liam's world, 1,000 miles away in Seattle, was no less turbulent. He stood in his penthouse office, the Puget Sound, a restless expanse beyond the glass, his reflection a stranger in the polished surface. The gala in Napa had changed something in him, though he couldn't pinpoint what. Natalia's quiet strength, the way she'd faced his family's scrutiny without flinching, had left a mark deeper than he'd expected. He'd spent his life avoiding entanglements, keeping his heart as guarded as his empire. But she was unraveling him, thread by thread. Her stories of Jacob of Englewood, of a mother whose love lingered like a half-remembered song, had stirred something in him, a longing for a life less calculated, less cold. Yet it was her silence, the secrets she held in her guarded eyes, that kept him awake at night, wondering what truths she carried and why they felt so vital to him. It was a chance discovery that set the wheels in motion, a file on Natalia's table, tucked between bills and Jacob's medical records, mentioning a military research project funded by Smith Enterprises in the late 90s. The name Angela White appeared in a footnote listed as a data analyst. Natalia's hands trembled as she read it, the words blurring through a haze of grief and suspicion. Her mother had been meticulous, her mind sharp, her heart fierce. Why would she work on a project tied to a company like Smith Enterprises, and why had her death followed so soon after? The questions gnawed at Natalia, each one a splinter under her skin. She hadn't meant to tell Liam, hadn't wanted to drag him into the shadows of her past. But when he appeared at the hotel that evening, his presence as inevitable as the tide, she couldn't hold it back. They sat in a quiet corner of the service lounge, the hum of the city muffled by concrete walls. Natalia's voice was steady, but her fingers twisted the edge of her apron as she spoke. "My mother worked for your company," she said, her eyes fixed on a crack in the floor. "Some project with the military. She died a month after it ended. They called it an accident, but I never believed them." Liam's jaw tightened, his mind racing to connect the dots. Smith Enterprises had funded countless projects under his father's reign, many shrouded in secrecy, sealed under national security clauses. He'd inherited the company's legacy, but not its sins, or so he'd thought. What was the project, he asked, his voice low, a thread of dread weaving through it. Natalia shook her head, her lips a thin line. "I don't know. But I need to. For her. For me." Liam didn't hesitate. Back in Seattle, he summoned his legal team, demanding access to archives buried in the company's vaults. The process was slow, the resistance fierce lawyers citing confidentiality executives, warning of reputational risks. But Liam was relentless, his need for answers driven not just by Natalia's pain, but by a growing unease about the empire he led. Late nights blurred into early mornings, his office lit by the glow of screens and the weight of discovery. The truth emerged in fragments. A project called Horizon, funded by Smith Enterprises in 1997, involved experimental medical trials on underserved communities in Chicago's South Side. Natalia White had been a civilian contractor analyzing data on the trial's effects. Her notes uncovered in a sealed file hinted at ethical concerns, questions about consent, whispers of harm. Then a month later, she was gone, her car found mangled on Lakeshore Drive. No witnesses, no investigation beyond a cursory report. Natalia felt the truth before Liam told her, sensed it in the way his calls grew shorter, his voice heavier. When he returned to Chicago, a folder in hand, she knew the moment had come. They met in a small diner in Wicker Park, its neon sign buzzing faintly, the air thick with the scent of coffee and grease. Liam slid the folder across the table, his eyes never leaving hers. "You were right," he said, his voice steady but laced with something raw. "It wasn't an accident." Natalia opened the folder, her hands steady despite the storm inside. Pages of reports, emails, a photograph of her mother standing beside a man in a suit, Edward Smith, Liam's father. The caption read, "Natalia White, Data Analyst, Horizon Project." Her mother's smile was bright, but her eyes held a shadow, a warning Natalia hadn't seen as a child. She closed the folder, her breath shallow, her heart a drumbeat in her chest. "What did they do to her?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Liam leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly as if to keep himself from reaching for her. "The project tested drugs on people who didn't know what they were signing up for," he said. "Your mother found out, started asking questions. She was going to talk to a reporter. Then," he didn't finish. Didn't need to. Natalia's eyes burned, not with tears, but with a fury she'd carried since she was 10, a fury that had no name until now. "They killed her," she said, the words a blade sharp and final. Liam didn't deny it, didn't soften the truth. "I don't know for sure," he said, "but I'm going to find out. And if it's true, I'll make it right." The promise hung between them heavy as the rain that began to fall outside. Natalia wanted to hate him, to see him as an extension of the company that had taken her mother, but she couldn't. Not when his eyes held the same fire she felt, not when his hands trembled as he spoke. She saw the boy beneath the billionaire, the one who'd grown up under his father's shadow, who'd learned to hide his heart behind a wall of control. Liam, too, was unraveling his world of order, crumbling under the weight of a truth he couldn't ignore. He'd spent his life believing in his family's legacy, but now he saw its cracks, its bloodstains. And Natalia, with her quiet strength and her unyielding grief, was forcing him to confront it. They sat in silence, the diner's hum a distant echo. Natalia's fingers traced the edge of the folder, her mother's face vivid in her mind. She thought of Jacob asleep in their apartment, unaware of the storm brewing around them. She thought of the years she'd spent running, hiding, surviving. And she thought of Liam sitting across from her, offering not just answers, but a fight she hadn't dared to wage alone. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice steady despite the chaos inside. Liam's gaze softened, a flicker of something tender breaking through his resolve. "We find the truth," he said. "Together." That night, Natalia lay awake, the city's pulse a faint throb through her window. She felt her mother's absence like a physical ache, but for the first time it wasn't just pain, it was purpose. Liam's promise had ignited something in her, a spark of hope she'd long since buried. But hope was dangerous, and she knew it. Trusting him meant risking everything: her heart, her safety, her brother's future. Yet when she closed her eyes, she saw him not the CEO in a tailored suit, but the man who'd sat across from her in a diner, his hands shaking, his voice steady, offering to carry her pain. And Liam, back in his Seattle penthouse, stared at the city below his mind, racing with questions he couldn't answer. He saw Natalia's face, her eyes fierce with grief and fire, and knew he was no longer fighting for his company, but for her, for a woman who'd slipped into his life like a storm, reshaping everything he thought he knew. The Chicago dawn broke in slivers of gold, slicing through the blinds of Natalia White's South Side apartment, where the air held the faint scent of coffee and worry. She stood at the kitchen counter, her hands gripping a chipped mug, her eyes fixed on the city beyond the window, a city that felt like a tightening noose. The truth about her mother's death, uncovered in Liam Smith's folder, had cracked something open inside her, a wound she'd thought long scarred over. Angela White's life, her questions, her silenced voice now pulsed through Natalia like a second heartbeat. But with truth came danger, a shadow that clung to the edges of her life. She'd found a note slipped under her door 2 nights ago, written in sharp, jagged letters. "Stop digging, or Jacob pays." Her brother asleep in the next room, his insulin pump, a quiet hum, was her anchor, her reason to keep moving. But now every creak of the floorboards, every stranger's glance on the street felt like a threat, a reminder that the past was not done with her. In Seattle, Liam paced his penthouse, the Puget Sound, a restless mirror to his thoughts. The revelation about the Horizon Project had shaken him, not just because of its brutality, but because it bore his family's name. Smith Enterprises, his father's legacy, was a house built on secrets, and he'd been too blind or too willing to ignore its foundations. Natalia's pain, her quiet fury, had become his own, a fire that burned through the walls he'd built around his heart. He'd promised her the truth, but the cost was higher than he'd imagined. Board members whispered of instability, investors questioned his judgment, and his father, Edward, now partially recovered from his stroke, watched him with eyes that held no warmth, only calculation. Liam had always been his father's son, molded to wield power without question, but Natalia had changed that. She was not just a woman he cared for. She was a mirror, reflecting the man he could become if he dared. The threats began subtly, a shadow moving too quickly, in a Chicago alley, a phone call with no voice on the other end. Liam flew back to the city, his presence a quiet storm in the Four Seasons service corridors. He found Natalia in the laundry room folding linens with a precision that belied the tremor in her hands. "You're not safe here," he said, his voice low, urgent. She met his gaze, her dark eyes fierce but weary. "I've never been safe," she replied, her words a blade wrapped in velvet. "But I'm not running, not anymore." Her defiance stirred something in him, a mix of admiration and fear. He wanted to protect her, to shield her from the danger he'd helped unearth. But he knew she wasn't a woman who needed saving. She needed a partner, someone to stand beside her in the fight. The note had come from Victor Kane, a name Liam recognized from the Horizon Project files. A former contractor with ties to Smith Enterprises, Victor had overseen the trials, his signature on documents that spoke of acceptable losses in cold clinical terms. Now he was a ghost from the past, a man with a grudge and resources to match. Liam's investigation had stirred a hornet's nest, and Victor was at its center. When Natalia showed him the note, her hands steady, despite the fear in her eyes, Liam made a decision. "You and Jacob are coming with me," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "To a place where he can't touch you." She protested her pride, a wall between them. But the thought of Jacob, 16, vulnerable, her only family, crumbled her resolve. By nightfall, they were in a safe house in Evanston, a quiet suburb, where the streets were lined with oak trees, and the air felt cleaner, softer. The safe house was a world apart from Natalia's apartment, its hardwood floors and wide windows, a stark contrast to the peeling paint and flickering lights she knew. Jacob explored it with a teenager's curiosity, his lopsided grin a balm to Natalia's frayed nerves. But safety was an illusion, and she knew it. Late at night, as Jacob slept, she found Liam in the living room, his laptop open to a grainy video sent anonymously to his email. It showed a teenage Natalia, barely 15, standing in an alley, her face bruised, her eyes hollow. A boy older and sneering held her wrist, his voice a low taunt. The video cut off abruptly, but a message followed. "She's not who you think." Liam's jaw clenched, his fingers hovering over the keyboard, but he didn't look away from her when she entered. "Who sent this?" she asked, her voice a whisper, her heart a drumbeat of dread. "Victor," Liam said, his eyes searching hers. "He's trying to break us." The words hung heavy, a truth neither had spoken aloud. Us, them, a bond forged in stolen moments, now tested by a past that refused to stay buried. Natalia's knees buckled, and she sank onto the couch, the video replaying in her mind. That night years ago had been her first betrayal, a boy who'd promised friendship and delivered pain. She'd fought back her nails, leaving marks, but the system had failed her, branding her the aggressor. She'd buried it, locked it away with her mother's death, her foster home scars, her borrowed name. But now it was here, a weapon in Victor's hands, aimed at the fragile thing growing between her and Liam. "Tell me," Liam said, his voice gentle but firm, his hand reaching for hers. She pulled away, her breath hitching, but his gaze held her steady and unyielding. "I was a kid," she said finally, her words raw, jagged. "He was someone I trusted. He hurt me. I fought back and they blamed me. No one believed me." Her voice broke, but she didn't cry. She'd spent too many tears on that memory, and she had none left. Liam listened, his silence a kind of reverence, his hand finding hers, again this time, holding tight. "I believe you," he said, and those 3 words shattered something in her, a wall she'd built, to keep the world at bay. She wanted to push him away, to tell him he didn't belong in her pain, but his touch was an anchor grounding her in a storm she couldn't face alone. Liam's own heart was a battlefield, torn between fury and guilt. Fury at Victor, at the system that had failed her, at his own family's complicity in a legacy that had crushed lives like hers. Guilt for dragging her into this, for stirring a past that now hunted her. He'd spent his life avoiding messes, but Natalia was worth every risk, every bruise. "I'm not letting him win," he said, his voice low, fierce. "Not over you, not over us." She looked at him, her eyes searching for a lie, but found only truth. For the first time, she let herself lean into him, her head resting against his chest, his heartbeat a steady rhythm beneath her cheek. The safe house was quiet, the world outside a distant hum, but the danger was closer than ever, a shadow creeping toward the light they'd begun to build. Victor's next move came swiftly, a package left at the safe house gate containing a single photograph of Angela White, her face serene, but her eyes sharp, standing beside Edward Smith. Scrawled on the back were the words, "She knew too much. So do you." Natalia's breath caught her fingers trembling as she held the photo, her mother's face, a mirror to her own. Liam stood beside her, his hand on her shoulder, his silence a promise. "We end this," he said, his voice steady despite the storm in his eyes. "For her. For you." Natalia nodded, her fear giving way to resolve. She'd spent her life running, but now with Liam beside her, she was ready to fight, not just for her mother's justice, but for the life she was beginning to believe she deserved. The night stretched on the safe house, a fragile sanctuary, and as they stood together, hands entwined, they knew the battle was far from over. But for the first time, they faced it as one. The Oregon dawn crept softly over the rolling hills, its light spilling through the pines and painting the world in hues of amber and hope. Natalia White stood on the porch of the small house she now called home, her bare feet cool against the weathered wood, her hands resting on the gentle curve of her belly. The air was crisp, fragrant with cedar and earth, a far cry from the asphalt and exhaust of Chicago's South Side. She was 24, pregnant, and carrying a secret that felt both like a gift and a weight. The news had come weeks ago, in a sterile Evanston clinic, the doctor's words, a quiet thunder. "You're expecting." She hadn't told Liam Smith right away, hadn't known how to shape the truth into words. Her life had been a series of battles against poverty, against a system that saw her as less, against the ghosts of her mother's death. But this was different. This was a life fragile and new, tethering her to a future she'd never dared imagine. Liam, too, was navigating uncharted waters. In the quiet of their Oregon refuge, far from the glass towers of Seattle and the shadows of Chicago, he felt the ground shift beneath him. The safe house in Evanston had been a temporary shield, but Victor Kane's threats, the note, the video, the photograph had made it clear that safety was a fleeting illusion. Moving Natalia and Jacob here to a house nestled in the Willamette Valley was his attempt to build something real, something lasting. The house was modest by his standards, its white clappered walls and wide windows, a stark contrast to his Seattle penthouse. But it was a place where Natalia could breathe, where Jacob could laugh without looking over his shoulder. Liam spent his mornings fixing creaky doors, or tending the garden tasks that felt foreign to a man who'd built an empire with keystrokes and contracts. Yet each small act was a tether binding him to Natalia, to the life growing inside her, to a version of himself he was only beginning to know. Natalia felt the change in him, saw it in the way his hands moved with care, the way his storm-gray eyes softened when they met hers. But she also saw the tension in his jaw, the late nights he spent poring over emails, chasing leads on Victor Kane. The man who'd sent the photograph of her mother Angela was no longer just a shadow. He was a blood tie, a cousin cast out by Liam's grandfather, his resentment a poison that had festered for decades. Victor's latest move had come in the form of a package delivered to the Evanston safe house. Just before they'd left, a stack of forged documents suggesting Natalia's mother had been complicit in the Horizon Project, a lie meant to fracture her trust in Liam. She'd seen through it. Her mother's memory too vivid to be tainted by forgery, but the attempt had left a mark, a reminder that Victor would stop at nothing to destroy what they were building. She told Liam one evening as they sat by the fireplace, the crackle of wood a soft counterpoint to the weight of her words. "I'm pregnant," she said, her voice steady but her hands trembling, clutching the silver bracelet that bore her mother's inscription. Liam froze, his coffee mug suspended mid-air, his eyes searching hers, for a truth he wasn't sure he was ready to face. Fatherhood was a concept he'd never considered, a risk too vast for a man who lived by control. Yet, as he looked at Natalia, her dark curls framing a face that held both strength and vulnerability, he felt not fear, but a quiet certainty. "We do this together," he said, his voice low, unwavering. "Whatever it takes." He reached for her hand, his fingers warm against hers, and in that touch, she felt a promise not just to her, but to the life they'd created. The days that followed were a delicate dance, a balance between hope and the shadows that refused to fade. Natalia woke each morning to the scent of pine and the sound of Jacob's laughter, his teenage energy filling the house with life. She taught him to cook her mother's recipes, collard greens, cornbread, the kind of food that tasted like home, and watched him sketch the valley's hills, his drawings, a testament to a boy finding his place in a world that had once seemed too small for him. But at night, when the house was quiet, Natalia's dreams were haunted by her mother's face, by the photograph Victor had sent, by the fear that her child would inherit a legacy of pain. She'd lie awake, her hand on her belly, whispering to the life inside her, "You'll be free. I'll make sure of it." Liam, too, was haunted not by dreams, but by the weight of his choices. He'd confronted his father Edward in a sterile Seattle office, the older man's eyes cold as he dismissed the Horizon Project as necessary progress. The words had cut deeper than Liam expected, not because they surprised him, but because they confirmed what he'd always feared, that his father's empire was built on bones, and he'd been complicit by ignorance. Victor's connection to the family, his status as a shunned cousin, added a layer of betrayal Liam hadn't anticipated. He didn't tell Natalia everything at first, not out of deceit, but because he wanted to shield her from the ugliness of his bloodline. But secrets had a way of surfacing, and when she found him one night, staring at a letter from his grandfather that confirmed Victor's lineage, she demanded the truth. They stood in the kitchen, the moonlight spilling through the window, casting their shadows long and tangled. "He's your cousin," Natalia said, her voice sharp with disbelief. "And you didn't tell me." Liam's jaw tightened, his hands clenched at his sides. "I didn't know," how he admitted, his voice raw. "I didn't want you to see me as part of this mess." Her eyes blazed, not with anger, but with a pain that mirrored his own. "I'm not fragile, Liam," she said. "I've carried worse than this. But you don't get to decide what I can handle." Her words were a challenge, a call to meet her as an equal, and he did. He told her everything: Victor's birth, his disinheritance, his decades-long vendetta. And when he was done, Natalia didn't turn away. She stepped closer, her hand finding his, and said, "We bury this, all of it." The next evening they drove to the riverbank that bordered their property, the water a silver ribbon under the stars. They carried the forged documents, the photograph, the letter pieces of a past that had tried to break them. Liam built a small fire, the flames licking the night air, and together they watched the papers burn, the ashes rising like ghosts set free. Natalia's hand rested on her belly, her eyes fixed on the fire, and she felt a weight lift, not fully but enough to breathe. Liam stood beside her, his arm around her shoulders, his warmth a shield against the chill. "This is ours now," he said, his voice soft but certain. "Our life, our family." She nodded, her heart, a fragile thing, not yet whole, but healing. The weeks that followed were a quiet rebellion, a reclaiming of something neither had dared to claim before. Natalia walked the valley's trails, her steps lighter, despite the growing weight of her pregnancy. She read to Jacob on the porch, her voice steady as she spoke of futures they could build. Liam scaled back his work, his empire no longer the center of his world. He spent evenings with Natalia, their conversations soft and unguarded, their laughter, a new language they were learning together. But the past was never far, its echoes in the rustle of leaves, the flicker of headlights on the road. Natalia knew Victor was still out there, his silence a threat louder than words. And Liam, though he didn't say it, felt the same, his nights spent watching the horizon, waiting for the next blow. Yet, in the quiet moments when Natalia's hand found his, when her smile broke through her guarded heart, he believed they could outrun it, not just the danger, but the pain that had shaped them both. The Oregon spring unfurled like a quiet promise, its wildflowers blooming in riots of color across the Willamette Valley, their petals catching the morning light like fragments of hope. Natalia White stood by the kitchen window of their clapboard house, her hands cradling the swell of her belly, now heavy with the life she and Liam Smith had created. The air was thick with the scent of lilacs and fresh earth, a world away from the concrete and chaos of Chicago's South Side. At 24, she had spent her life running from poverty, from pain, from a past that clung like damp fog. But here in this valley, where the sky stretched wide and forgiving, she felt something new, a stillness not of surrender, but of choice. The child within her, a girl they'd named Angela, after her mother, was a beacon, a reason to believe that love could outlast loss. Yet, Natalia's heart still trembled, caught between the joy of what was and the fear of what might come. Victor Kane's shadow lingered, his silence, a storm waiting to break. And though she'd burned his lies by the river, she knew the past was never truly gone. Liam stood on the porch, his sleeves rolled up, his hands stained with soil from planting a garden he'd never imagined tending. The man who'd once ruled boardrooms with a glance was learning to measure his days in simpler things. The weight of a shovel, the laughter of Jacob, Natalia's brother, as he tossed a basketball against the barn. Liam's life had been a fortress of control, built on the steel and glass of Smith Enterprises. But Natalia had dismantled it, not with force, but with her quiet strength, her unguarded heart. He'd left Seattle behind, trading his penthouse for this house, his empire, for a nonprofit dedicated to righting the wrongs of his family's legacy. The Horizon Project. The trials that had taken Angela White's life had been exposed, the truth laid bare in headlines that shook the corporate world. Victor Kane, the cousin who'd sought to destroy them, was now in custody, his threats silenced by a whistleblower's courage. But the victory was bittersweet, the cost measured in trust broken, and a family name tarnished. Liam didn't regret it. Natalia was worth every fracture, every fight. The labor came on a Sunday, the sky soft with clouds that drifted like dreams. Natalia's breath caught as the first contraction rippled through her, a wave of pain and promise. Liam was there, his hand steady in hers, his voice a low anchor, as they drove to the small clinic in town. Hours passed in a blur of effort and hope, Natalia's world narrowing to the rhythm of her body, the warmth of Liam's presence. When Angela was born, red and wailing, her tiny fists clenched, as if ready to fight the world. Natalia felt her heart crack open, not with pain, but with a love so vast it stole her breath. She held her daughter, her skin warm, against her own, and whispered, "You're here, little light." Liam stood beside her, one hand on her shoulder, the other tracing Angela's tiny foot, his eyes bright with tears he didn't try to hide. In that moment, the world was theirs. Natalia, Liam, Angela, a family forged not by blood, but by choice. The months that followed were a tapestry of small joys and quiet healing. Jacob, now 17, thrived in the valley, his sketches of Angela, whom he called Bean, filling the walls with color. He'd joined the school's basketball team, his lopsided grin a constant reminder of the boy who'd kept Natalia fighting. She enrolled at the University of Oregon studying law with a fire that burned brighter each day. Her mother's death, once a wound, was now a purpose, driving her to advocate for those the system had failed. Liam co-founded the nonprofit, with her naming it the Natalia White Foundation, a tribute to a woman whose courage had reshaped their lives. He worked from home, his days filled with grant proposals and community outreach, his nights with Natalia's laughter and Angela's soft coos. The empire he'd once ruled felt distant, a shadow he no longer needed to chase. Yet healing was not linear. Natalia woke some nights, her dreams heavy with her mother's face, with the alley where she'd been betrayed as a teenager, with the fear that happiness was a gift she didn't deserve. She'd slip out to the porch, the stars a quiet audience, and let the tears come, not out of weakness, but because she was learning to feel without shame. Liam would find her, his presence a steady warmth, and sit beside her, his silence a language of its own. I'm afraid she admitted one night, her voice soft against the cricket song. What if this is too good to last? He took her hand, his fingers threading through hers, and said, "Then we fight for it, every day." His words were a vow not just to her, but to the life they'd built, to the daughter who slept inside, to the brother who called this valley home. The community embraced them not as a billionaire and a maid, but as Liam and Natalia, the couple who'd planted roots in a place that valued heart over history. They hosted barbecues by the river, Jacob teaching the neighbors' kids to shoot hoops, Natalia sharing her mother's recipes with women who'd become friends. One evening at a community center event, Natalia stood before a crowd, her voice steady as she spoke of her mother, of the Horizon Project, of the justice she'd fought for. "We don't heal by forgetting," she said, her eyes finding Liam's in the audience. "We heal by choosing to build something better." The applause was warm, but it was Liam's quiet nod, his pride a tangible thing that made her heart soar. Angela grew her laughter a melody that filled the house, her tiny hands reaching for the world with a fearlessness Natalia envied. One afternoon as they walked through the valley, Angela toddling between them, Liam stopped his gaze on the horizon. "I used to think I had everything," he said, his voice low, reflective. "But I was wrong. This, you heard Jacob, this is everything." Natalia smiled, her heart full, and leaned into him. Angela's giggle, a soft echo in the breeze. The past still lingered, its scars a part of them, but it no longer held power. They'd burned its lies, faced its threats, and chosen each other again and again. As the sun set, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Natalia and Liam sat on the porch, Angela asleep in her crib, Jacob sketching in the living room. The valley was quiet, the world at peace, and Natalia felt a certainty she'd never known. "Do you think we were meant to find each other?" she asked, her voice soft, her hand in his. Liam looked at her, his eyes a storm calmed by love. "I think we were meant to fight for each other," he said, "and I'll never stop." She leaned into him, her heart steady, and whispered, "Then let's keep fighting." To you reading this story, let your heart be bold. Love is not a gift given freely. It's a battle won through courage, through choice, through the willingness to face the shadows and still reach for the light. Natalia and Liam found each other in the chaos, built a family from the ashes, and chose to love even when it hurt. So choose your own fight, whether it's for love, for justice, or for the dreams you've buried. Hold tight to those you cherish, stand firm against the storms, and never stop believing that your story, like theirs, can end in hope. Fight for it every day, and let the world see the light you carry.